It's not about fixing the other person. It's not wanting to feel the anxiety or the feelings inside of me when the other person is behaving in a certain way. So it's, Gabor Mate, I remember famously said, it's not the fear of rejection or abandonment, it's the fear of having the feelings when I'm abandoned. So it always goes back to, can I tolerate discomfort? Can I be with whatever's happening inside of me?
Have you ever felt something was wrong but couldn't explain it? Like the person you love was slowly chipping away at your sense of self?
We've been there. Different marriages, but to the same man, with the same toxic pattern. But God was still working.
We're Lizzie and Dina, women of faith, survivors, and truth tellers.
Surviving toxic relationships is for any woman stuck in confusion, healing after betrayal, or searching for her voice again.
You are not crazy.
You are deeply loved. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Surviving Toxic Relationships. We're so happy that you're here today. And we have a wonderful guest, Dr. Sarah Michaud. She's a clinical psychologist who has worked in the field of addiction and codependency for over 30 years. Dr. Michaud is the author of One Psychologist's Recovery from Codependency and Addiction, a memoir and manual for freedom. She has been sober for over 40 years and brings her humor, directness, and compassion and insight to support folks in recovery. So, Dr. Michaud, we're so happy that you're here. Today, we want to hear how you got from your story to where you're at today. As I was chatting with Sarah before the show, I'd really love to kind of make today's focus on addiction. And if you are dealing with addiction with your partner, and I don't know if this person's a narcissist or they're a sociopath or psychopath or what they are, but it looks like they may have an addiction, and I feel just as crazy no matter what the label is.
And part of the reason, hi everybody, my channel's called Leaving Crazy Town, is because I had so many patients over the years come into my office, and the first thing they would say is, I feel crazy. And I know crazy isn't a great term in like the feminist movement, etc. But that was the main word that they said over and over again. When someone is in a relationship with an addict or with a narcissist or with someone who lies or is spinning tales or makes them feel like they can't trust themselves, they really feel crazy. So, and most women come into therapy because of relationships. That's just what they do. I mean, I saw people with addiction problems, obviously, also, but lots of damage when you're an addict in our relationships. So just saying that out front. So my name is Dr. Sarah Michaud, and I've worked with addiction and codependency for over 30 years. I got sober also in 1984. Someone referred to me last night, I have a 25-year-old, as his grandmother. I did. So I am older, and I got sober a zillion years ago, and I'm super grateful for that because, I mean, there's so many ways to get sober now. And I feel grateful I did when I did, and I never had a relapse. So I'm super grateful for that. So I ended up going back to college and graduate school and specializing in addiction. And I was just saying to you guys, I ended up moving back to Boston, getting a job at a hospital here that I was in 1984 for addiction. So it was full circle. And the even most bizarre thing that I could tell you guys, which is really crazy, is I started dating the psychiatrist who I actually saw in 1984. Okay, it was brief, and he didn't recognize me. Lots of crazy stories I have to tell.
I'm sorry, while we're on that subject, I just have to ask, because, inquiring minds need to know, did you ever tell him that you were his patient?
I told him in bed one night, and because I felt like he couldn't escape. But it was really funny because he must have been like he was beginning his career. And so I was there in 95, literally like 10 to 12 years later. And he was a little shocked, and the relationship didn't work out over 4 months. We dated and it was fine, but it was kind of odd, I have to admit. But of course, did it stop me? No. I mean, One thing that happens with addiction, I don't know what you know about addiction, but a lot of time when someone puts down a substance, I often say when I speak, I put down the substance and I picked up everything else. So, I picked up food, men, sex, relationships, achievement, athletics at one time. So, I mean, we can switch addictions very easily. And recovery is really about unraveling and unpacking and facing your history, everything that led to your addiction, and resolving a lot of that stuff, because otherwise you are going to switch addictions. And I also want to say that you can put down substances. I just heard about a guy, one of my friend's boyfriends killed himself just a week ago. Now, he had 5 years of recovery. But if you don't address what we call those underlying causes and conditions and resolve some of your stuff, you're either going to get super depressed, you're going to get super anxious, you're going to act out in some other way, you're going to get repressed. It's going to happen. It's going to manifest in some way. So it is true that folks can be sober and end up with a multiple of other issues. So it's really critical to dive deep. And I think there's a delicate dance to that, just probably recovering in a narcissistic relationship where you want to dive in enough where you're facing some reality, but you also don't want to dive in too quickly where you risk your mental stability. So it is this very delicate kind of dance of going in self-care, going in distraction, going in taking care of yourself, all of that. I got pregnant, had a child. I've been married twice, by the way. And my first husband, I would say, was a narcissist. And my second husband had 15 years of recovery and he relapsed. And my life blew up. And that's why I ended up writing a book about codependency, because I thought, if I have a PhD, I've been sober for 25 years at the time. I'd been going to Al-Anon for 20 years at the time. And I was struggling with managing it, then the average person is going to be totally lost. So I really felt like I had a lot of the pieces to kind of give some tools, advice, share my own story around how I got through that period of time, because so many people have addiction and everybody knows an addict. I mean, it's everywhere. And it's not an easy thing to navigate, just like it's not an easy thing to navigate being in toxic relationships. Initially, a lot of it was helping women to kind of find themselves, empower themselves. What I used to say is come home to themselves, because they had lost themselves initially in an addiction, perhaps. But then ultimately, when you get into relationships, very often women, because of our training, basically of being caretakers and helpers and all that stuff, let alone pathology, we can end up focused on everybody else, our partners, our kids, our bosses, and we can slowly chip away at our own identities and become like these pieces of Swiss cheese and not even know ourselves. And I think that happens when you're with an addict, and it happens when you're with a narcissist. So a lot of overlap here.
Wow. So I guess one question that I may have is, how can someone tell the difference between supporting a struggling partner with addiction or possibly enabling a destructive behavior?
Yeah, it's very tricky. And I will say part of the trouble of why it's so hard for people to know what the right thing to do in a relationship with an addict is because the bottom line fear is that they're going to die. So, meaning if I ask my 20-year-old to leave the house because he's shooting heroin or whatever, he might die. But the fact is, he might die in the basement shooting heroin. Just because you're asking someone to leave has nothing to do with whether they're going to die or not. Yet the feeling and the experience is, I'm going to be responsible. So it's so counterintuitive. And it's also what I call the big lie, which is, if I focus on getting you better, I'm using quotes, getting you better, or helping you, which means I'll call the psychiatrist, I'll call the treatment centers, I'll see if I can manage your alcohol use, I'll just dose out the pills, whatever it is. The problem with that is it does not help them and it does not help you. So it actually takes both of you down. And really, what recovery from codependency is about is saving your own life. And in saving your own life, there's more of a possibility that they're going to want to save their own. So it's very layered and it's very kind of amorphous. I mean, it's not like when I was a cocaine freak and an alcoholic, I knew that I got to quit those things to get better. But when you have someone using in your life, and I'm a codependent, someone will say, well, what do you do? What do you do? And the thing is, you're going to do less. That's the counterintuitiveness of it. You're going to stop focusing on helping them and you're going to start focusing on saving yourself. And when you start learning about setting boundaries and not taking out your anger on them and figuring out what works for you in the relationship, and you can learn how to communicate that, it's much different to say, honey, I love you. It's so painful for me to see you die of your drinking, but I need you to either get help or I need you to move out in the next couple of weeks. That's much different than someone screaming and yelling week after week after week. Can't you get sober? Don't you know what you're doing to me? Like, all that does is escalate the situation and give them a reason to drink.
It sounds like it's kind of a twist on trauma bonding. There's just that perpetual trauma and bonding and all that good stuff that goes with it.
You're absolutely right, because I mean, I've seen, and I truly believe this, codependents can die from codependency. I mean, I've seen women sacrifice so much of themselves and lack of self-care. They won't go to a doctor, and the next thing, they're dying from something they never addressed. I mean, when someone is in a serious state of caretaking someone else and trying to save someone else, they lose themselves. And I've sat with couples where I'll ask a question to the partner and they'll keep answering for their addict. They won't even know how they feel, what they think. They won't even have access to it. It's really interesting because one of my closest friends was married to an alcoholic and they went to couples therapy. And when they were in there, she tells this classic story about the therapist asking questions to her and her husband. And she keeps answering, he's doing this, he's doing that, he needs to do this, he needs to do that. And she's over functioning, over managing, which is a huge part of it, right? And finally, the therapist says, hey, Linda, can I ask Bill some questions? And starts to address him and ask him about his addiction, what he's willing to do. And after that, my friend says, but what am I supposed to do? And the therapist says, you just need to rest. You just need to rest for a while. And that's really, in very simplistic terms, how you start recovery, by starting to rest. Because usually by the time, and I would think the same with someone who's in a narcissistic relationship and traumatized, they're so focused on, oh my God, what is reality? What, all of that stuff, that their mind's spinning, their feelings are spinning, their behaviors are trying to figure out how to solve things, and you become exhausted. So go ahead.
So I went through that where I had this epiphany that I had to stop trying to make him okay so that I'd be okay. And I've said this on many podcasts, so everybody's heard it. But I'm wondering, because what saved me, I felt like, was taking all that energy, because my energy had to go somewhere. I had to fight somehow because I desperately needed to be okay, which of course at the time I was thinking I desperately need to have this man get better so that we can have a family and we have children, and they'll get hurt and it'll be a tsunami and everybody will die emotionally from this tsunami. And I have to save our family. We're about to die. So I am doing all this. And then finally had the epiphany, probably, 20 years in, 15 to 20 years in, that he was not going to change. And I was probably making it worse and pushing him away. So I took all that energy and I put it into getting myself healthy, which finding out what codependency was, finding out, reading books about women who love too much and,
all
lose
of that.
themselves. And that helped me. But I know you did say rest. So would that be a form of resting if that's kind of where you
Yeah, I mean,
take your
I'm just
energy?
meaning rest, meaning stopping the behavior. Like really pausing. That's all I mean. I'm not like saying you need to just like chill for the next 5 years. I'm saying initially, you said it. You said it. It's just stopping. And I do a lot of work with people around kind of unconscious fears because I talk a lot about fears that were established growing up, like fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, fear of you getting mad at me, fear of not being loved, not being liked, other people's opinions. We do a lot of that work in AA. And there's two fears we're born with. And it's the fear of loud noises, and I think the fear of falling. But all those relational fears are basically an event happens, we have the emotional response and a belief about it, and that's it. And then the problem with that and the tragic part of that is then we project that on every person we meet. So when we're in an intimate relationship, those fears get activated over and over and over again. And so stopping and stepping back, and you just said it. I always say this too. It's not about fixing the other person. It's not wanting to feel the anxiety or the feelings inside of me when the other person is behaving in a certain way. So it's, Gabor Mate, I remember famously said, it's not the fear of rejection or abandonment. It's the fear of having the feelings when I'm abandoned. So it always goes back to, can I tolerate discomfort? Can I be with whatever's happening inside of me? And the trouble is, 99% of the time we're having some kind of activation. It's not even about the present. So if I have a rage response to, I don't know, something my 25-year-old is doing, I don't know, let's just give an example. It's really about, I say to myself, what is the fear that's being churned up? Okay. And a lot of times it's the fear of no control. The fear of no control is across is really a big base one. And so then I'll say to myself, when have I felt like this before? And usually what comes up is an incident of some kind where I didn't feel in control. I tried to manage it. The fear was there. And then what happens when you're a kid is you figure out all these survival skills that are brilliant when you're a kid, right? I never pathologize them because whether it's acting out or lying or whatever, it's a way we survived a tough, traumatic time. The problem is those tools don't work in adult relationships. So it's figuring out, these are these tools that I've used, these survival skills, these way of relating that I've used my whole life. Maybe it's shutting down when someone gets angry, whatever, but they don't work. So I'm an adult now. This other person is an adult. If I'm in a really intense fear response, it may not even be about them. It's usually about the past. So that's one thing that really helps when you kind of can look at, somehow separate from the present moment, because that's the real hard stuff when our old stuff gets activated.
Yeah, well said. I love that. Goodness. Okay, good stuff. So since we do talk a whole lot on this channel about narcissistic relationships, what are some of the overlaps that you see in an addiction situation with a partner versus a narcissistic relationship? What are some similarities in that?
Right. So it's interesting because in AA, in the big book of AA, they say self-centeredness is the root of our troubles. So a lot of people who get sober, and the self-centeredness is basically, I'm just focused on myself. It's not necessarily like a selfishness, like I'm a selfish person. It's more, I'm so preoccupied with me, because that's what addiction is, right? Addiction is all about, I need to get my drugs so I feel okay. at the cost of any relationships, at my job, at my kids. It doesn't matter. It's all about me. And I'm not an expert at narcissism in any sense of the word, but I think, if there's a narcissistic wound of abandonment or trauma or whatever, the narcissist is totally focused on losing what they have and needing to keep what they have, right? And it's all about managing and controlling people around them to not feel whatever that wound is. And again, I'm not an expert, but I would say there's a lot of overlap. One thing I think about also is with addiction, someone is completely detached from their feeling states, right? So the idea, a friend of mine says addicts are relief-seeking missiles. And that's really what we are. We just want relief. Now, a lot of times we don't know what that relief, is for. But I feel like narcissism is similar. Whatever games they need to play, whatever universe they need to create with their people that they're controlling and managing and lying to and fearing abandonment of, it's all this way to not feel or experience whatever is deep inside. I mean, I don't know if they ever get that. I guess it depends on the degree of narcissism, where it's a true personality disorder, or, I know it's on a spectrum, right? So a complete detaching from what's happening internally. It's all about mastering the external, trying not to experience what's inside and escaping, I would imagine. Another thing is just lying, right? Addicts. I had this client once, and he said, and this is similar to a narcissist, is he'd say, I'd come home to my wife after being gone for 3 days, and she'd open the door, and the first thing I would say is, she'd say, where have you been? And he'd say, why would I come home to this messy house? Like, now you're nagging me? Of course I've been gone. Like, he would, within seconds, his wife was apologizing to him. Now that's addiction, and that's narcissism. So it's creating, oh my God, I have goosebumps just telling you that because it's so awful. It's this chronic creating of someone doubting their reality. So I've had patients come to my office who are drunk, and I'll say, geez, it seems like you've been drinking. And they'll say, I haven't been drinking. And there'll be a split second in my mind where I think, well, am I smelling? Because it's so, when someone is chronically, confusing and making you doubt your reality, same thing across the board with addiction. That's why people stay in addiction for so long, because, when my husband relapsed, he was brilliant at, again, I used to say, I don't know if I came home and George was tired and sleeping on the couch after a hard day of work, or he'd taken a bunch of Percocets. I don't know, because the fact is he would never acknowledge if he took Percocets. So you're always doubting reality. And one of the tools, and I was wondering about this, if this would help with being in a narcissistic relationship, is what they use in an intervention with an alcoholic is what I call sticking to the facts. So when you're doing an intervention with an alcoholic and all the family members get there, you don't talk about how your feelings have been hurt. You don't say, Mom, I wish you would stop drinking. What you do is you say, you forgot to pick me up at school 3 times. You were drunk when my friend Joe came over for the sleepover. You just give facts, because there's nothing that an alcoholic can't argue with facts. So that's what really helps with the person that's in the relationship with the addict. And it helps when you're trying to help someone get sober, because they are in denial. Denial is the quintessential component of addiction. And it's also one of the components of being in a relationship with an addict or a narcissist. Rationalization, the reason a lot of people think addiction is like a mental illness, it's in the DSM as a mental illness, is because there's all these cognitive components. There's denial, there's rationalization. I can say, oh, my wife treats me like crap, that's why I drink, or my boss is angry at me, or whatever. I can make up any reason to drink, minimizing, I only drink on Mondays and Fridays. Like, what's the big deal? I actually had a client tell me one time that they were 3 months sober, and then they went to a wedding one weekend, and he came in and he said, "Oh, I did great. I was sober the whole time." And then by the end of the session, he mentioned that he had a glass of wine, and I said, "Oh, I thought you were sober." He says, "Sarah, beer and wine aren't alcohol." So, I mean, that's denial, and that's mental illness. Narcissists can rationalize. You guys told me some of your story, and what's fascinating, you don't know this about me, and we could talk about this on another channel. I have a relative who recently we found out had another family. And yeah, and it's so interesting when he was kind of caught and the rationalizing about his behavior was wild. She was in another country and he was separated from this wife, and my wife doesn't do this. And I mean, it's so I would think that there's lots of overlap, and I think, again, just like addiction and codependency is on a spectrum, I think when you're with a narcissist, it's on a spectrum. I often give the example of a mom who has a new baby and she becomes way overprotective of that. I've known moms that literally won't let their husbands watch the baby for now. That's fear, right? And then we've got, the couple that are 70 and have remortgaged their home 4 times so their kid who's now in prison. So I mean, it's on a spectrum. And yeah, so I know I've gone on a lot, but
no, I was actually kind of gonna rabbit trail a little back because I was thinking you're like the overlap. The one thing with someone with addiction is the let's say the daughter saying you forgot to pick me up 3 times. Well, and I would agree because I've heard narcissists with all the evidence showing otherwise. They would say, "No, I didn't. I only forgot you once."
right.
So
Right.
yeah, and then kind of
Yes.
going on to our story when you were sharing about the family member leading a whole different life and
Yes.
how they weave this story or justification. The first thing that popped in my mind is when our ex, when he left, he was escorted out with police and he was given a restraining order and a file for an annulment from her. We call her Jane.
Okay.
And the first thing when he realized that she found out the truth was, "You don't know my side of the story." So I was just thinking of all
Right.
the little triggers there and how I can see the difference.
Yes.
But yet, yes,
Yes.
there is a little bit of that overlap, but it's kind of fascinating that, yeah, the narcissist will say, "No, I didn't do it that many times."
When you think of the degrees of mental illness, because I think about it, reminds me of someone who comes to me and their partner is not willing to let go of their addiction. So they have to say goodbye to someone that they love, but the person keeps saying, "I don't have an addiction problem," right? So, like the narcissist, who I think, I don't know if they're treatable or can get help, or I mean, you know a lot more than I do about that. But at that moment when he's caught, it's like an addict saying, "I don't drink that, but you're making it up." Like, you think it's the same thing, like this lack of the ability to acknowledge what they've done. And I think I don't know. It's like, do the addicts who aren't ready, is it just too painful to eventually see the wreckage? With a narcissist, is it more, a deeper wound? Is it more psychological that they can't actually see it? I don't know. I mean, you would know more. Do narcissists can they eventually face and admit the truth, or is that not a common part?
It's very, very,
Very rare.
Very
It's
rare.
extremely
I
rare.
thought
Matter of fact,
so.
my psychologist, when I was leaving after 27 years, and I went to him and said, "I have invested so much time into this relationship and so much effort, and we have children." And he said, "There's less than a 0% chance he's ever
Yeah,
going to change."
that's
So I mean, he said if he was younger and really started doing some intense therapy and was admitting that there's
Right.
definitely a problem, he said, but by the time they get to a certain age, it just becomes part of their neural
Right.
pathways.
Yeah.
So he said it's less than
Yeah.
Right.
And that's the key, like Dina said, it's the fact of getting that constant therapy because they can't admit they have an issue. And there's been some narcissists that have been married and they keep themselves kind of in check in different ways. They found
Yeah.
strategies and then with the relationship. And you also have the sociopaths.
Right.
They don't
Yeah.
have a chance.
And then,
Right.
like you said, spectrum everywhere. And
Yes.
sometimes they have two disorders that that interact or overlap or whatever, and so it
Right.
becomes very complicated. But so, Sarah, I know we're going to wrap this up soon, but I think one of my last questions I would love to ask is if somebody's out there listening today and they're like, I do feel like my partner has an addiction, what would be some signs that they possibly do have an actual addiction, even though they're screaming from the rooftops that they don't?
Yeah, I mean, again, I would really look at facts. Do they say they're gonna come home or meet you somewhere and they're always late, or they're really unpredictable? They break promises all the time. When you're with them, do they seem altered in some way? Does their behavior change? I mean, that's the trouble too. Some addicts may get fun and quieter and you may not notice it. And some might get angrier and agitated. So it really depends. But the biggest thing I would say, which is really hard when you're in this situation, is trust yourself. If you see or feel that something is off, it usually is. And when I worked at a residential treatment center for quite a while, what would happen is someone would relapse and nobody would admit it. But something started to get crazy at the place. You know what I mean? You can't get external validation, just like with codependency, from someone else. You have to get a reality check. You could go online and look up a list, are you a codependent or how do you know? Go to the Al-Anon website. There's tons of questionnaires, because you don't want, what's hard, like you say, people stay. I mean, what's the average? I think the average amount of years you stay in even a domestic violent relationship, 10 years. I mean, these relationships are very hard to kind of get yourself out of unless there's huge crises or and that's the trouble, because we get more and more used to the behavior. And so it's easier the whole story. So it's really, the first thing you can do is really start to access your own thoughts, your own feelings. What do I see here right now? And reach out for help for some place online or an Al-Anon meeting and get some support and do what I call reality checking. We've been talking about. Call your friend and say, because a lot of times the co-addict can be in just as much denial. I heard at a meeting one time, her husband fell off the rider mower or whatever, and they went to the hospital, and she'd been married to him for 30 years or whatever. And they went to the emergency room, blah, blah, blah. And the doctor said, hey, well, it's obvious that your husband has a drinking problem. And the woman was like, what? They'd been married for 30 years. The doctor's telling her that he practically has cirrhosis. So he's had a serious, and she's been in la la land, because however she's coped, her own checking out of some kind to survive that. So again, this kills both people, just like in a narcissistic relationship. You lose yourself and they lose themselves. The thing with addiction, and I'm sure with narcissism, is you're not going to change them. I'm not going to change an addict. I can change myself, and I can say, look, I need you to leave in the next few weeks because I need a sober partner. The problem is, some people are going to admit it and some people aren't. And just like with narcissism, they might blame you. And it's building up your own sense of identity and your own empowerment and your own community and support or therapy or whatever, so you have enough power to speak what you need. I mean, that's the other really common thing, is not having a voice. So we could talk about so many things, but thank you.
Yeah. That's great. Well said. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was very enlightening. I know that's going to be super helpful.
Absolutely. We appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me. It was great to meet you guys.